Thank you all so much for being here tonight. Very glad to have a good sized group here tonight. For anybody who doesn't know me, I think most everybody does, but I'm But Me, one of the monks. And I'm very excited to start this new Thursday night series, Discovering the Dhammapada. So for the next 4 weeks, we'll be talking about the Dhammapada and meditating on it and applying it to our daily life. Something new that I don't think we've done here at the temple before, and what I like to do for some of the classes that I'm going to be teaching. I'm going to teach a number of classes throughout the year. And to set our intention, I like to start each session with a gatha. And this gatha is the gatha of Munsu Saribosal, or Manjushri, the Bodhisattva of wisdom. So I'm going to pass these around here. And if you would like to join me in reciting this, we'll start our discussion with this gatha together. And you can save this paper on the back side. Is going to be our closing recitation at the end of the hour. Great, thank you. So together we say, homage to Deji Munsu Sari Bosal, the Bodhisattva of great wisdom, who holds to his heart a scriptural text symbolic of his seeing all things as they are, whose intelligence shines forth like the sun, unclouded by the two obscurations, who teaches in 60 ways, with the loving compassion of a parent for his only child, all creatures caught in the prison of samsara, confused in the darkness of their ignorance, overwhelmed by their suffering. Munsu Bosal, whose thunder-like proclamation of Dharma arouses us from the stupor of our afflictions and frees us from the iron chains of our karma, who wields the sword of wisdom that cuts down the roots of suffering wherever they appear, clearing away the darkness of ignorance, whose princely body is adorned with the 112 marks of a Buddha, who has completed the stages achieving the highest perfection of a bodhisattva, who has been pure from the beginning. We pay homage to you, Deji Munsu Sari Bosal. Om Mara Pasha Nadi, Om Mara Pasha Nadi, Om Mara Pasha Nadi. With the brilliance of your wisdom, O compassionate one, illuminate the darkness enclosing our minds, enlighten our intelligence and wisdom, so that we may gain insight into the Buddha's words and the texts that explain them. Namu Deji Munsu Sari Bosal. Namu Deji Munsu Sari Bosal. Namu Deji Munsu Sari Bosal. Thank you for joining me in that. I'm going to give you a few different handouts as we go along for this, and kind of help show the kind of structure or vision for how we're going to kind of approach the text and the kind of structure of the next 4 Thursdays. So I see some of you brought some copies of your Dhammapada, which is great. I see a lot of a few different editions and translations. The one that I'm going to focus on and use in the context of this class over the next 4 weeks is this one, the Eknath S. Warren translation, which I think most of you have, and if not, I have copies and excerpts of the readings for each week. There's a few other popular translations available. I see you have the Gil Fronsdale one there. That's also one listed on the sheet. And there's a few other free ones by some other Theravadan monks that have been around for a bit longer, available on access to Insight. For this class, we're going to stick with the Eknath translation, so we're on the same one. And I'll say a little bit more about why I chose this one and why we're not going to compare translations over the next 4 weeks. But afterwards, certainly, be welcome to read any translation you want and compare and investigate. But there's a specific reason we're going to stick with one for our purposes here. The weekly structure for this, like you saw tonight, we'll start off with about a 15-minute meditation, since we're all coming from different places during the day to kind of settle, have our discussion. I'll say a little bit, but I want this to be more interactive and conversation than really a lecture per se. Tonight maybe a little bit more as we get started, but in the coming weeks more conversation. And then we'll close with a short meditation at the end with our discussion. And then I have a kind of layout here for the next few weeks. I want to start talking a little bit, just introduction to the Dhammapada as far as its context, its significance, and where it kind of sits in the Buddhist canon of Scripture. I'll share a little bit, and I have some other papers I'll give you here, as far as some different ways to think about approaching and methods for studying Buddhist texts. And in this context, we're not looking at the Dhammapada from academic or scholarly or critical context, or even as literature, but as part of a spiritual practice. And that's what we're going to focus on doing. So between the weeks, too, I'll ask for all of us, as best we can, is to integrate whatever part of the Dhammapada that we're on as part of our own spiritual practice, and connect that to our daily lives. So that's the kind of approach we're going to take with that. So this week, we're only going to really look at the first chapter of the Dhammapada, because we're going to talk about some of these other things too in the first 20 verses of the Dhammapada. Next week, we'll continue on. We'll reflect on our practice through this upcoming week. And then next week, I'll share some of the connected stories of the Dhammapada that are found in some of the other commentaries. And I'll say more about that in a minute. And then we'll move forward with further chapters. Week 3, continue. We actually are probably not going to get through all 26 chapters of the Dhammapada in only 4 weeks. We'll be rushing through it as it is quite a bit. This could be an entire year-long course. So this is more kind of an introduction to discovering it, rather than idea of completing it. So our practice together, my hope is that it inspires you to continue to use the Dhammapada in your daily life and read it over and over and over and over. So just to get us started. And then the last week, I think I have something interesting. There are actually multiple different collections or renditions of the Dhammapada across different schools and sects that have developed throughout history. And there's a Chinese Dhammapada too, which is less well known and more rare, but Thich Nhat Hanh actually has a commentary on a chapter that does not appear in the Pali version of the Dhammapada, but in the Chinese Dhammapada. There's a chapter there that most people have not heard of or read before. So I'm going to end the 4 weeks looking at something a bit less familiar on that. So that's the kind of plan overall as we go forward. I also there's a Google group on the bottom, and I have a pad of paper. If you want to leave your email, I can email you all of these handouts and some readings and other things, and other reminders along the way. So before you leave tonight, just leave your email down there if you want to join that. So let me talk just briefly about a little bit of the context and the significance of the Dhammapada before we jump into the first chapter and start looking at that and talking about it. So this handout here is more just for your reference to take home. You don't have to read this right now or follow through with me on it, just so you have it if you want to look at this at some point. Just a few points I want to mention about the Dhammapada. Is there anybody that has not read the Dhammapada at all before, or this is your first? Good, great, awesome, very good. All right. So the Dhammapada is one of the most widely read and popular Buddhist books across the world, in both Theravadan traditions, Mahayana, and pretty much all Buddhist sects, and even in the non-Buddhist world too. The Dhammapada is grouped in the great, religious literature of the world, and more than probably some people would argue more than any other Buddhist book or text or sutra, the Dhammapada has been utilized as a kind of life manual or field guide or handbook to practice. And some people have said that if all other Buddhist scriptures and sutras were lost, if only the Dhammapada was left, you would have the entirety of the Buddha's teachings, and that's all you would need to find your way towards awakening and liberation. So we'll get into that in our conversation and throughout. So where the Dhammapada is situated in the canon of Buddhist texts, it's the second book in the Khuddaka Nikaya, which is one of the 5 Nikayas of the Sutta Pitaka, the collection of suttas. Not that really matters for us, but if you were curious and wanted to know, because there's this vast array of Buddhist scriptures and sutras and things like that, and you probably see a lot if you start looking online as far as what's a Nikaya and Pitaka and all these things. We're not really getting into that here, but just know the Dhammapada is part of the Pali canon, and that's where it sits. So the Dhammapada, in its Pali version that we're going to be looking at, contains 423 verses divided into 26 vagas, or sections, or chapters, you can call it. And the verses are broadly associated with a topic, which have predominantly ethical themes. Although they're not sequential, it's more of an anthology or collection of verses. So they're not connected in that sense, but rather how the editors and commentators and ancestors have compiled and put them together in particular arrangements. And different versions of the Dhammapada have different verses and different chapters laid out in different ways. But again, this is probably the most common one that we'll come across. Like I said, next week I'll share some of the background stories that inspired the verses in the Dhammapada, which is one of the most interesting things to me, to get that, even if they're apocryphal, or meaning, we don't really know if they're true or not, but they're really good, I think, parables and moral teachings, and kind of help to envision maybe some of the context in which some of these teachings and insights can imagine ourselves in there. And it may be helpful too, as we're practicing, to recall some of the stories to see how maybe we find parallels in our own life too, and how they come up. So interestingly about the Dhammapada, more than 50% of the verses are found elsewhere in the Buddhist canon as well. So that's why we get this anthology of verses, because we can crosswalk and find these verses all throughout the rest of the Buddhist canon. If you're interested in something like that, actually I think Gil Fronsdale's translation has that in the appendix in the back. Not the, I don't think this version does, but there are a few translations of the Dhammapada which show you the other locations of some of those verses. I just want to share one more thing about the Dhammapada, and then we'll jump into the text itself. I want to read this excerpt from Bhikkhu Bodhi's introduction from a 1985 translation by Acharya Buddharakkhita's translation, which is on the Access to Insight site that I put on the other handout. So this is what Bhikkhu Bodhi has to say at the end of his introduction about the Dhammapada. He writes, "As a great religious classic and the chief spiritual testament of early Buddhism, the Dhammapada cannot be gauged in its true value by a single reading. Even if that reading is done carefully and reverentially, it yields its riches only through repeated study, sustained reflection, and most importantly, through the application of its principles to daily life. Thence, it might be suggested to the reader in search of spiritual guidance that the Dhammapada be used as a manual for contemplation. After your initial reading, you would do well to read several verses or even a whole chapter every day, slowly and carefully, relishing the words. You should reflect on the meaning of each verse deeply and thoroughly, investigating its relevance to your life, and apply it as a guide to conduct. If this is done repeatedly, with patience and perseverance, it is certain that the Dhammapada will confer upon your life a new meaning and sense of purpose. Infusing you with hope and inspiration, gradually it will lead you to discover a freedom and happiness far greater than anything the world can offer." I think that's a pretty powerful insight into what the Dhammapada has to offer us and why it holds such a significant and important place in the Buddhist world and practice, and why I wanted to start with the Dhammapada versus anything else we could look at. I think the Dhammapada also is probably one of the most accessible and approachable Buddhist texts because of the way the verses are laid out. It's very easy for anyone to understand. It has a different kind of style and structure than when you start looking at some other Buddhist sutras, which can be very difficult to engage because of their logic and writing style and other things like that. So if this is a good starting point and springboard into Buddhist scripture, say rather than jumping right into the Majjhima Nikaya or something like that, which I would not recommend if it's your first venture. Yeah.
So I'm just I have a confusion
Okay.
because my understanding is that after the Buddha died, that his disciples wrote down his teachings from memory.
Mm-hmm.
So this is not that exactly what they what they wrote down as being his direct
Right.
teachings. This is just part of it, or
So you think back to 2,500 years ago, like approximately 500 years before the Common Era, right? The Buddhist tradition was orally transmitted for even hundreds of years after the Buddha's death, and nothing was written down until probably about, and different people peg it at different times, but approximately like 200 or 300 years after that the first kind of written records, which most of those have been lost and then reinterpreted and recollected from memory. So like I said, what's in the Dhammapada, these 423 verses, are all more than half are found throughout other Buddhist scriptures too. So it was this constant evolution of memory, of transcription, of documentation over a very long period of time that evolved into this.
Similar to the Bible, where those may not be the direct words of Jesus. These may not be the direct words of Buddha as recollected.
Most of what's in here is, I think a lot of people would attribute pretty much everything in the Dhammapada to the words of the Buddha. There's a few places, and if you jump into, again, from the academic side, you can say some verses, maybe came from somewhere else, or the Buddha acknowledges, weren't his words, but kind of common folk knowledge of the era and things like that.
Somebody else's interpretation of that.
Yeah, so I mean, we can really get in the weeds with all
I
that.
didn't want to get in the weeds.
Yeah.
Understand.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Exactly what this was.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
I think the easiest for me, and the way I like to think about it, is your own personal ethical and moral guidebook, right? And kind of a primary source for us, Dhammapada. It has lots of ways there's two words there, Dhamma and Pada. In a lot of ways, those two words and that compound can be interpreted and translated. For us, the path of Dharma, right, or the guide to Dharma is one way to translate what this title means and kind of what's in here. So that's what we're going to try to, how we're going to try to use it. But yeah, to be honest, I don't know all, the history and background and context. It's actually, I spent a bit of time compiling some of these notes, but even the history and the scholarship around the Dhammapada is not a super easy field. I mean, a lot more has been researched about in non-English languages, like in Sinhalese and Burmese and Thai and Pali and all those other source languages. So there's a lot, I think, the English world maybe doesn't know about the history and the context of the Dhammapada. But again, for us, I don't know that necessarily matters so much. But it's a good question. Yeah, I like to think that a lot of all the verses in here. Again, we can imagine, even if we don't know or believe that they are the words of the Buddha. Does that help?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, that makes perfect sense.
Cool. All right. Very good. Any other questions or thoughts or anything before we open up the first chapter? No? All right. So if anybody doesn't have, I know some of you do have a copy of the Eknath translation, but if not, I did I have a printout of the first chapter, if anybody needs a printout of that. If you don't have this particular translation, I can print off the chapters that we study, in this class. But if you want to pick this up, it's pretty affordable. I think it's like $11 new on Amazon. So it's not super expensive like some other Buddhist scriptures are. Like if you want to buy the Avatamsaka, that'll set you back probably a $1.50, something like that. All right. So we're just going to start with chapter 1, the twin verses. Here, if you have the book, it's on page 105. There's 20 verses. So I'm just going to read through the chapter once, so you can follow along or just listen if you like in a intentional way, and then we'll talk about it for a few minutes before we close in a little bit. So the twin verses. Our life is shaped by our mind. We become what we think. Suffering follows an evil thought as the wheels of a cart follow the oxen that draw it. Our life is shaped by our mind. We become what we think. Joy follows a pure thought like a shadow that never leaves. He was angry with me. He attacked me. He defeated me. He robbed me. Those who dwell on such thoughts will never be free from hatred. He was angry with me. He attacked me. He defeated me. He robbed me. Those who do not dwell on such thoughts will surely become free from hatred. For hatred can never put an end to hatred. Love alone can. This is an unalterable law. People forget that their lives will end soon. For those who remember, quarrels come to an end. As a strong wind blows down a weak tree, Mara the tempter overwhelms weak people who, eating too much and working too little, are caught in the frantic pursuit of pleasure. As the strongest wind cannot shake a mountain, Mara cannot shake those who are self-disciplined and full of faith. Those who put on the saffron robe without purifying the mind, who lack truthfulness and self-control, are not fit to wear the saffron robe. But those who have purified their minds, who are endowed with truth and self-control, are truly fit to wear the saffron robe. The deluded, imagining trivial things to be vital to life, follow their vain fancies and never attain the highest knowledge. But the wise, knowing what is trivial and what is vital, set their thoughts on the supreme goal and attain the highest knowledge. As rain seeps through an ill-thatched hut, passion will seep through an untrained mind. As rain cannot seep through a well-thatched hut, passion cannot seep through a well-trained mind. Those who are selfish suffer here and hereafter. They suffer in both worlds from the results of their own actions. But those who are selfless rejoice here and rejoice hereafter. They rejoice in both worlds from the results of their own actions. Those who are selfish suffer in this life and in the next. They suffer seeing the results of the evil they have done, and more suffering awaits them in the next life. But those who are selfless rejoice in this life and in the next. They rejoice seeing the good that they have done, and more joy awaits them in the next life. Those who recite many scriptures but fail to practice their teachings are like a cowherd counting another's cows. They do not share in the joys of the spiritual life. But those who know few scriptures, yet practice their teachings, overcoming all lust, hatred, and delusion, live with a pure mind in the highest wisdom. They stand without external supports and share in the joys of the spiritual life. So there's a lot in that first chapter. You see why we're not going to get through the whole Dhammapada in just 4 short weeks. Very dense with a lot of wisdom and insight. So just like to kind of open it up for any kind of reflections, reactions, impressions, thoughts.
Yeah, I've got a lot, but I won't take up everybody's time. We can share. One thought I had was the translation they use for passion.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times we think of passion as a positive thing. Somebody's very passionate about what they do, right? And it's like they put their whole heart into it. And I relate that a lot to the Eightfold Path and right livelihood, like having the right passion, doing the right thing, or something to that effect. And so here it's translated in a way that passion is something that seeps into your untrained mind. What do you think about that?
I noticed that too. I was like, is that a bad thing? Is passion bad? I don't know. I didn't think so.
I don't know, I took passion as kind of being heightened emotions, any heightened emotions.
Yeah,
You know.
like out of balance, maybe?
Or maybe like control of the heightened emotions?
Yeah, out of control emotions, which usually is like anger and, when we think of passions that are negative, anger, greed, lust, those kind of things, but even positive, passion, it can be out of control.
Which verse were you looking at,
This is
Buffy?
verse 13 and 14.
13 and 14.
Rain
Let's read.
seeps through an ill-thatched hut. Passion will seep through an untrained mind.
Mm-hmm.
And as I get older, my hut is not as well thatched anymore.
Well, I think that's kind of really difficult, like, because that somebody's passion has a lot to do with how we view somebody. It gives you a sense of like self, right, or purpose, like, you know. So that is kind of difficult to.
There's another loaded term in Buddhism, the self.
Right, right. I didn't mean it that way, but yeah. I mean, there's a lot of craving and like demands behind passion. You know?
So this is a challenging verse to kind of situate and reconcile. We can see passion as being a positive, you know, virtue or energy in some sense. How do we fit it into what the Buddha is talking about here that seems to have more of a unwholesome or potentially kind of destructive power to it, right?
Does it say what the Pali word for this translation into passion is?
Not right here. Yeah. But yeah, that would be something to maybe.
Interesting.
But again, I think, yeah, we could find it, right? We could get a Pali version and kind of approach it from that angle to find out what's the word that was really used here. But I think like what I like to do here, and if you're willing to entertain me, is struggle with this verse this week and see if you can figure it out
Oh crap.
without.
When I think
Yeah.
about like the forest through the trees, and I don't focus on the word passion, and I think about it in the whole context of those two verses, and I think like my takeaway is that if I don't have control over my thoughts, that's when my untrained mind can go out of, go on a bender. And if I have control, like if my hut, I guess would be my mind. I'm not really quite sure on the analogy part, but you know what I mean? Like if I have control of what I'm trying to think and how I'm trying to be and where I want my mind to go and what thought seed I'm going to water, then it'll depend on what kind of mind it goes to.
That's how it started, right?
What about this? So the analogy here that the Buddha is talking about is passion is like rain. So maybe that's another thing to consider too, because we talked about the hut, right? Your, depreciating hut, right? And think about, yeah.
The Anne Bancroft translation renders it desire.
Desire, okay,
Yeah.
yeah.
So I think at the very beginning of the verse, the first page, when he describes in 3 and 4, he was angry with me, he attacked me, he defeated me, he robbed me. The key words and that on both of those verses are dwelled on, right? So that for me is the link for you can have passion, but the dwelling is what causes that thatch hutch to open up and cause mayhem. So he's saying, you can have those who dwell on it, and I'm a dweller. This is why I picked up on that. I'm very good at it. And so when you get into the verses that we were talking about, I'm thinking that the passion can't seep through the mind that doesn't dwell, right? That leaves. So there is the link for me.
I also think about the intensity, right, of the passion too, like rain, keeping with the rain metaphor, right? And rain itself, doesn't necessarily have, inherent healing or destructive properties, right? It depends on a lot of conditions and factors, whether that rain can be nourishing and rejuvenating or if it can be destructive, right? If you have too much and excess, right, you get flooding and damage and all of that. But on the other hand, there's rain or passion in the right dose and amount and given the right conditions, it can be very beneficial, right? So matters of degrees and extremities with it too.
Yeah, I just wanted to say those two verses, 3 and 4, really, that they were very powerful for me too. And looking at them, I noticed it's all in the past tense. He was angry with me. He attacked me. He defeated me. He robbed me. Actions that somebody else did it did to me in the past, not, things that I might fantasize might happen in the future or that I would be worried about, but things that actually happened in the past. Those are the things that I'm a dweller too, and I tend to dwell on those. And the memory, when the memories come up of something that somebody did to you even long ago, and if you dwell on them, you'll never get out of that cycle of not necessarily hatred, but just constantly obsessing about, things that were done to you, and that's where an untrained mind, tends to get into those untamed emotions, not having the self-control to let things go when they come up.
Yeah, that's a good observation, good insight. Yeah, I like you pointed out the aspect of the temporality aspect of it, these thoughts, being in the past, right? And looking at it from that vantage point too is, I think, significant in here, right? That idea of dwelling too. Okay. See, so there's a lot. I mean, we really kind of dug into 2 or 3 verses out of the 20 here.
Yeah, right.
Right? So we can, I know, I wish we had more time. Maybe we'll have to do this in another format or just continue this and not limit it to 4 weeks perhaps. Really enjoying this and all of your insights and reflections here. So we only have a few minutes left in the hour, and I'm sure there's a lot more insights and reflections here. What I'd like to do is invite you to stay with chapter 1 for this coming week. Read chapter 1 in the same translation, so we're using the same language and the words here, if at all possible. And like I said, I invite you to treat this more as a practice rather than a critical examination or things like that. As tempted as we might be, and I have that tendency too, because I'm really academically minded, right? And I got notes and stuff, and I'm not even going to look at those. I'm gonna play too, right? There may be some verses that we struggle with to understand what does that mean, or how do we reconcile that or interpret that. But that's part of this practice, right? So stay with chapter 1 this coming week, and maybe each day keep a little notepad or journal of one verse that resonated with you on that particular day. If you see it kind of manifest in your life in some way, or one verse sticks with you for a particular reason, just take a note of that. And then when we come back next week, hopefully you all can join next week. We'll talk about kind of our experience and our practice with chapter 1, and maybe some other verses will pop up throughout the week, or maybe ones that were confusing, or say, I don't know how that applies, or that doesn't make sense. We'll talk about that. So that'll be the practice for the coming week, chapter 1. Okay? All right. So we'll just end with a short, maybe 5-minute sitting, just to, since we learned so much and talked about so much, just to kind of close out. here, and then after the 5 minutes, we'll close with the closing recitation on the back of our recitation sheet here.
Oh, it's right there.
Is it right?
Be closer to the altar. Okay, there you go.
Okay. We'll close with the closing gatha on the back of the sheet I handed out earlier. And together we say, the Dharma, incomparably profound and minutely subtle, is rarely encountered, even in hundreds of thousands of millions of kalpas. Now we see this, hear this, receive and maintain this. May we completely realize the Buddha's true teaching, and may the merit of our practice, our study, and our efforts penetrate into each thing in all places, so that we and every sentient being together may realize the Buddha way.